Hey everybody, I'm Brett Ween from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Today I'm going to be talking to Ryan Price, Project 2025's Senior Manager for Chapter Engagement, about suicide prevention in the correctional environment. So what is Project 2025? Why is the correctional environment important for suicide prevention? Well, we're going to find out in just a second. So without further ado, please welcome Ryan Price.
Thanks so much for this conversation today, Brett. I really appreciate taking the time. I'm looking forward to what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, me too. This is a really interesting topic to me because it's one of those things. Before I worked at AFSP and was involved in suicide prevention, it's a specific aspect, an angle to it that I wouldn't naturally have thought of, but as I've learned about it, it makes perfect sense. And so I'm eager to have you tell me more about it, and obviously for other people watching to learn more about it. So let's just to get started. Um, why is suicide prevention important in the correctional environment? For those who don't know, what does that mean, the correctional environment? And are people in custody more at risk than the general population?
Yeah, and thank you. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that in general terms, what we mean, the correctional environment, when we say that, that's typically referred to prisons and jails. But specific to Project 2025, the focus is generally correction systems. But where we got most of the data from is based on, people who are incarcerated in prisons and jails, there's a couple of things that go into why this was chosen as a focus area for Project 2025, and in part, it's related to the fact that in recent years, suicide in corrections has increased about 30%, and that's a really troubling trend that with some dedicated focus, we think we can help be a part of the reduction of it. And another critical factor that goes into what makes the corrections environment so unique as regards to suicide prevention is just the prevalence of serious mental illnesses. And so, there's a couple of definitions that we want to make just a clear distinction. One is that um, we define serious mental illness. This is a definition from the National Institute on Mental Health, but it's a mental illness that results in serious functional impairment which substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. So that's a small portion of actual, mental health within the United States. But it's much more prevalent in corrections. So to give you an example, in 2019, the NIMH estimated that about almost 21% of all adults in the United States experience some sort of mental illness, which includes serious mental illness. Of the serious mental illness in the United States, it's estimated that it's about 5% of people who have a mental illness, but in jails, that's actually 20%. And in prisons, it's 15% of people who have a serious mental illness. And so we know that there's a strong link to as a risk factor for suicide, which is, mental illness. And so, we have this environment where it's a controlled environment where there are more people than the general population who experience serious mental illness that tends to put that whole that population at increased risk, which is some of the kind of key reasons why correction systems was chosen as a focus area for Project 2025.
Well, that was great. Let me just backtrack for people.
Yeah.
So corrections is one of the 4 focus areas of something called Project 2025.
Yeah.
What, for people who don't know, Project 2025 is an initiative. It's sort of a bold goal that AFSP took on. Could you tell me just like from the bird's eye view, like what is Project 2025?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. We started kind of focusing in on corrections right away. We got a little ahead of
Well,
ourselves.
Well, that's storytelling. You want to, you want to join the story in progress as
Yeah,
like in the middle of the action. But
right.
let's tell people what Project 2025 is.
Yeah, you said it best, Brett. It's a bold goal that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention set to reduce the rate of suicide in the United States 20% by the year 2025. We started as an organization back in 2014, really thinking about what would it look like to have a bold goal like this in suicide prevention, and other health initiatives have done something similar, but what would it look like for suicide prevention? So we convened an expert panel of people who are the leading experts in suicide prevention. We looked at really who we're losing to suicide, how we're losing people to suicide, and where we're losing them. And what we came up with was basically a framework to think about the project in a way that could be real time. In other words, it can change as best practices, as new research comes out, as things change, the project can be changed. So we're nimble, but that it also focuses on settings rather than individual populations, because within the settings, the four focus areas of Project 2025, we feel strongly that if we can help to influence and to lead and facilitate change within these focus areas, that we will reach our goal. And so the focus areas are first firearms and suicide prevention, then healthcare systems, emergency departments, and then the final focus area for Project 2025 are correction systems.
That's great. Uh, I think that helped clarify it a lot.
Yeah.
And I think what's kind of exciting about Project 2025 is there was all this analysis that took place, and it was really kind of signaling to the world that um, here are proven things we know from the research into suicide prevention, and here's what we know realistically. These are how many lives we can save for each of these areas. Um, and it involves lots of buy-in from other outside organizations, from the healthcare environment as a whole, for instance, or the correctional environment. It does require sort of outside partnerships to get on board with it and make these changes take place that we know realistically can save lives. um, so I've always found it to be really inspiring and cool, because when we talk about suicide prevention, it's often, of course, you talk about the individual, and we start thinking about it in terms of that. But this is really taking kind of the same kind of approach as for other health, lead other leading causes of death. It's how you would look at it just across the board statistically. How can we make the most impact?
Yeah, and you said it best in that this isn't, AFSP coming in and saying, "Oh, you all are doing it wrong. We have a way." It's really a way for us to say, and to really, I think, encourage people to join in an effort that we're saying we've invested the time in figuring out how we can do this, but we need people's support. We need some dedicated focus here. And so it was never about us, saying people are doing anything wrong. It was never about AFSP thinking that we alone were going to be able to accomplish this goal. This is really a collaborative effort that involves many different organizations and many different industries coming together around this centralized call to save the most lives from suicide the fastest.
I mean, I just think it's so great. And so I applaud you. And we're going to hear more in a little while, Ryan, about how you were involved in this particular focus area before you joined our national staff. But let's talk a little bit more about corrections and that environment. So I understand there's a high risk for suicide in corrections, but for someone who's wondering, is there really anything, they're picturing someone in a prison, or one of the adults in custody. If someone wants to take their life, this is kind of a general suicide prevention thing, but is there really anything we can do about it? Just taking the devil's advocate question.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, because it is one of the hard questions that we have to wrestle with in all areas of Project 2025 is that what can we do about it? What are the biggest gaps, and where can we help to illuminate those and kind of fill them in a little bit? So, I mean, I think your question at its core, Brett, is there anything we can do about it? Absolutely, there is. Yes, and where I think we're focused on specifically with this Project 2025 initiative is at better um, is looking at how we can screen people for suicide and mental illness and then treat them more effectively. So if we think about things, all the way upstream from before people get into, a corrections facility or become under supervision, I think we have to wrestle with the question of why are there higher rates of serious mental illness in our prisons and jails? And I think it gets to some of the really big and difficult questions about justice reform that we're going through right now. But then, going into once people are into the system, we have to figure out better ways for screening people for risk of suicide or mental illness. And right now, in the community population outside of corrections, there are some fairly well researched tools for screening for risk. But there is not one yet that's been shown to be effective in corrections environments. So we've got some work to do there in order to know for sure that we're utilizing the best tools possible to screen for risk. But also, we have to think about more support and treatment options for people that are incarcerated. And, Brett, if you think about, how you or I could get help when we're struggling, I mean, we have so many options. We could text the crisis line, we could call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We could get help through an employee assistance program. We could go to a walk-in clinic whenever we wanted to, most likely, or, within reason, depending on when they're open within our community. We could set up appointment with our primary care doctor, or we could, schedule regular appointments with a mental health professional. We have a ton of different options, but if you are incarcerated, your options are fairly limited. Every single phone call you have, you want to make typically costs money. They don't have access to crisis support services like we do. Often they may not be able to get in to see a doctor or mental health professional, kind of depending on where they're housed. And so I think there's some momentum that we can make in some of these areas I've mentioned, and I'll let you get a breath in here in a second. But in terms of like the access to crisis hotlines and things like that, there are some examples popping up across the country where both states and local, like county municipalities, are working on ways that people who are incarcerated can actually access crisis services through the phone, just like we could on the outside. And there's some, innovative things happening that I think we're going to be seeing some results here soon. But the short answer to your question is about like, can anything be done? It's definitely yes.
That's great. And those are such good points. And I think also about how, you touched on mental illness. But, if you think about it, someone entering that kind of facility, regardless of mental illness or how they are in general, that's a very stressful, I mean, I feel silly even saying it out loud, but that's a stressful time in someone's life. And then they're, of entering that kind of facility, and there are all kinds of stresses unique to that. And then, going through their kind of, it seems kind of too poetic to say, like, their journey through that system. But they might have court cases going on. There are all kinds of stressful things happening. And so I guess it then becomes part of, what does that facility have in terms of procedures? And can those procedures, are there like touch points that can make a difference to make sure that staff is noticing what's going on, and there are all kinds of other, I mean, you can talk about this a little more too. I know there are unique considerations, like, some staff might they might have certain ideas about there might be a little stigma where they or
Mhm.
and some of it rooted in real stuff, like they might think, oh well, this person in custody is just faking it. How
Mhm.
do I tell the difference? So there are all those considerations going on.
Yeah, you're right. It's an unbelievably complicated, experience to go from living your life in the community to justice involved in court and everything to a sentence, 'cause I mean, that you have to deal with so many different complex things. What's my family gonna do? If you were the, primary breadwinner, are you gonna be able to find a job when you get back out? If you go and get incarcerated for an extended period of time, are you gonna be even safe in there? Are you at risk for being hurt by others? I mean, there's so many different things that, yeah, in addition to, the mental illness, that add like some complicated factors to that, for people that have never been, gone through that, we can't even imagine what that's like.
Yeah, I mean, and I just to draw a parallel kind of between this setting, the correctional setting, and
Mhm,
I think of like the healthcare setting, the other
mhm,
one of the other parts of Project 2025 where we analyzed how we can make the most difference, save the most lives in the
mhm,
shortest amount of time was the whole thing. And I think, to draw a parallel with like the healthcare setting, uh, we look at having, training doctors, just like GPs, to ask, make it part of their procedure to when someone comes in for a checkup, asking them, how their mental health is and so forth. And often it seems so simple to people outside of suicide prevention, but within the field, we know that just simply asking someone is often, it seems too easy, but the reality is that's often when just being asked by someone in that position, that's someone's gateway, their entryway to actually opening up and
mhm.
connecting with help. And it can be life saving. And so it's kind of the same, it's similar to, in the corrections environment where there probably are different touch points in terms of how the facility is run, where there are moments that if they just make it part of the procedure, I think statistically, we can make a huge difference and ultimately save some lives.
Yeah, those times of transition are a kind of a key component of this focus area, because at each transitional period, people, so many things can change, and for people who are incarcerated, that there are additional barriers to seeking help while they're incarcerated. So if we think about someone who maybe was receiving mental health care or treatment for mental illnesses in the community, if they get arrested and they go to jail, there's no guarantee that that treatment's going to continue while they're awaiting trial or after they get, if they get convicted. And so those key moments of transition to are important, because, and the same is true for people that maybe, they're serving time in a prison, they're being treated for a mental illness, they get out, there's no guarantee that they're going to be able to maintain that same level of care, when they get out. And so those are also, major areas that we can improve. And also, I want to say, Brett, I forgot to mention this before, another like really key area of potential improvement that, exists, I think, within the corrections environment, is that some of the historical practices regarding suicide watch, things like putting someone in isolation or doing like 15-minute check-ins, those are things that have been historically used as tools, but there's actually no evidence that they're effective, and they're actually not effective. And so that's part of where we're going, is in including, in making sure that we're looking at screening at key points of transition, that people, that staff are equipped to know how to adequately respond, but also that procedurally and practice wise, that we're not doing anything that could be harmful, that in fact we're changing the culture and encouraging practices that we know can save lives.
That's so interesting. And I mean, the other thing, for people who are watching, who may not be as familiar with AFSP, we started as a research organization, and everything we do, we're still the largest private funder of suicide prevention research. We co-sponsor an international research summit every other year, and so we're sort of leading the way with research in all of our programs, including Project 2025. Everything is based on what we know
Hmm.
from research. It's not kind of like what we have a feeling might be helpful, and so that's really interesting about those findings you just shared about like what we're kind of raised to believe, or what we see in movies about prisons and things like that. I think of like people having to give up their shoelaces and their belts and
Hmm.
things like that. So that's interesting that that's not all what we take for granted is
Hmm.
actually shown not to be helpful sometimes. So I want to have like an unexpected flip up a little bit for someone watching, because we've been talking about um, the people who are in custody, but suicide prevention in these facilities isn't just about adults in custody. I don't think, because I know about this a little bit already from working with you. So what about the people who work in corrections? Because if you think about it, they're at risk too. It's a really high stress environment.
Yeah, and I think, Brett, what's really important about this is that it highlights how Project 2025 is a part of the work of AFSP. It's not separate, but it's a part of it. And so that going back to the beginning of our conversation, we convened an expert panel to look at those environments, and then we also involved dynamic systems modeling to help us really come down with some actual projections. And so the projection for the correction system was that given by screening and identifying half of at-risk individuals at key points and delivering comprehensive care, we could estimate to save 1,100 lives. That's really, the core projection for Project 2025 in corrections really was in those settings for people who were incarcerated. But one of the gaps that we identified as a part of Project 2025 is the level of awareness and education for corrections officers. But and with that too, we sought to address sort of two concerns. Your point that you alluded to, Brett, about corrections officers kind of working in a high stress environment, that they might be at risk. That's true, and we could also think about a potential solution that would both encourage people who work in corrections to get help when they need it, but also equip them to support those in custody. And I think we'll talk about this program in a little bit, but to keep it a little bit brief, the CDC did a survey, or uh, the CDC developed a report on occupations that were associated with higher suicide risk, and the protective services occupation, which corrections officers are a part of, was recognized as having higher rates of suicide as opposed to the general population. And so for males in protective services, 26.4 per 100,000, and for females, it's 14 per 100,000, which is higher than the, general population. But also, working in corrections can add to some of the barriers that we already know exist in the community. And so it's not to say that, if you work in corrections, you're at risk because of these certain things, but we know part of the challenge we have about mental health in the United States is that less than half of people with a diagnosable mental health condition will actually seek treatment. So that factors into this, but also when you add in some of the unique stressors and environmental factors of working in corrections, you create a culture that may be less likely for people to actually seek help. So these are things like a culture of toughness, where seeking help isn't encouraged in some of these, correctional environments, but also working abnormal schedules. Prisons and jails don't close, in normal business hours. So people have got to be there all night, all weekend, on the holidays. And so that working those kind of schedules can put a strain on relationships. And also it could make seeking help a little more difficult, because if you're on your day off and you're normal, you go to work all night, you're up all night on your day off, it's going to be hard to get to, some appointments in that way. And so and also too, I think that one of the things that I've learned in talking with folks that work in corrections is that we cannot comprehend the complexity of their job. So in addition to, the challenges they have with just the schedules and kind of what they're doing, they're expected to keep other people safe from, the people that live in those facilities. They've got to keep them safe, they've got to keep themselves safe. And also in some places working in corrections, being exposed to trauma, to things that are difficult to see, it can be thought of as like a normal part of the job. And so there may not be as much support offered to people who work in corrections and their families, that when something traumatic happens, it's almost like, well, this is part of the job, so we got to deal with it. And I think that's, part of what makes it challenging to work in corrections, that actually might, put them at greater risk for suicide. But it's a lot more complicated than that. But I think that, you know, in our early conversations with staff, when we were like figuring out what are the needs in corrections, we heard loud and clear that there's a lot of good information for officers in order and for how they can, identify risk and keep people who are in custody safe. But there isn't a lot for people who are actually working in corrections. And it's something that they loud and clear said that there was an absolute need for more information about how they can get help for themselves and get help and support each other.
That's great. And I actually want to jump ahead to a question that I think is relevant right at this point in the conversation, which is that AFSP has an education program. It's kind of our landmark presentation program called Talk Saves Lives, which is available for schools, workplaces, places in your community, wherever. And it kind of gives people a very general understanding of mental health and suicide prevention specifically. And it's a great program, Talk Saves Lives. And now, thanks to work that you and your team have done, there is a special module of it. There's a special version of Talk Saves Lives specifically focused on corrections. So I was wondering what that looks like, what's included in that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that is like one of the first, presentations. It is the first presentation that we developed as part of Project 2025 for the corrections focus area. And as I was mentioning earlier, that staff are, it's important for staff to be able to not only identify if people in custody are at risk and get them the help that they need, but also for themselves. And so this Talk Saves Lives module, its intended audience is corrections staff. And our AFSP chapters across the country can help you deliver it if you're in that environment. But basically, it's a presentation that we combined information that Brett mentioned, that is introduction to suicide prevention. It introduces some concepts and some terms, and it's really, a great starting place for all of us to use shared language to understand what's happening and to be able to sort of describe it. But also, it helps to normalize help seeking for mental health. We talk about things that we're still at the beginning stages of, changing the culture around suicide and mental health. And this Talk Saves Lives presentation does a great job at that. And so this module for corrections staff has information for corrections officers. Our intent was to try and acknowledge the difficulty and the stressors that corrections staff have in their jobs, and encourage them to seek help, and also to create a culture within their facility, their department, that encourages help seeking, that encourages for people to take advantage of employee assistance programs, that highlights the importance of seeking help for mental health when you need it. So in addition to that sort of support and information for corrections staff, we also have information about the risk factors and warning signs for people who are incarcerated. They often they're the same types of risk factors and warning signs, but for people who are incarcerated, they will sometimes present or look a little bit different. And so we highlighted that. And I think one of the really key components of this presentation, among others, I'll just highlight one of them because I think it's great, is that there's a section of it where we actually invite people from the facility or the department to talk about the specific policies related to that department or that facility, both in terms of the specific resources that the staff have, and also the specific policies of what to do if a person in custody may be at risk for suicide. And so it's a great opportunity to supplement the information that correction staff already receive, or help to sort of be a great reminder about how we can all have a role to play in saving lives from suicide, both from people who are incarcerated as well as from the staff perspective.
Yeah, and I think thanks for giving that overview, Ryan. I'm familiar with that program, and I think it's, for anyone watching who's like feeling cynical about it in any way, I will just say it's what's great about it. It's not like some corny mental health program that the staff at a corrections facility are going to feel like, oh my gosh, they're not going to be rolling their eyes. It's packed with really like realistic strategies and things that I just think it's wonderful that it gets so into it, and was really eye-opening for me to read. So I think it's a great program. So I don't want to let you out of this interview, Ryan, without asking you about, before you came to our national headquarters and worked on Project 2025 specifically. You alluded to this, but AFSP has local chapters in every state. People who are interested can go to our website, afsp.org, and you can pretty easily like type your zip code in and find your nearest AFSP chapter.
Mm-hmm.
You were involved at the chapter level before you came on to national. You were in Oregon. And while you were there, you did a lot involving corrections in your local community. So I wondered if you could, now that you've talked about sort of the overview of corrections and Project 2025, how are you involved? Because I think that is that'll sort of paint a picture of how people in their local communities can get involved in helping these efforts.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Brett, and that it's one of the I don't know, most I guess enriching things I've been able to be a part of at AFSP. I was the area director for the Oregon chapter when Project 2025 was announced, and also in that same year, we had started the very first walk in the capital of my state, which is Salem, Oregon. There hadn't been an Out of the Darkness walk in Salem yet, and that year, we were hoping like we would be lucky if it raised $50,000, and we had like 500 people, but there was almost 2,000 people, and it raised $106,000. It was actually that particular year the largest first year walk at AFSP, and so we got a lot of like new people to attend the walk because there hadn't been anything in the community yet. And one of the people who attended was a staff at the Oregon Department of Corrections, and he's got a really interesting job within the corrections setting. Is that he's a retired firefighter, and he organizes work crews for like adult in custody work crews. So they go out and do different jobs of firefighting, wilderness firefighting in the summers, and other things. And within this program that he runs as a staff, there was a person in custody who is they call them different titles in different places, but he's basically someone that staff trusted with a little bit more responsibility. And the staff was telling this person in custody about this great experience at the walk and how impactful it was and how inspiring it was to see so many people um, um, acknowledging their link to suicide, which is not something that's easy to do. Like the stigma we've talked about. And this person who was incarcerated said to the staff, like, that's what I want to do when I get out. Like, he was due to get out in a couple of years, and the staff had this great question. He said, well, why not now? That's about how the conversation went, I think. And so they reached out to me. I went in for a meeting, and basically what they wanted to do was have something like an Out of the Darkness walk inside of this prison. And I was so, like, almost taken aback because I go into this thing, they close the door behind me, they give up my, the keys to my car, give them my driver's license, like, I can't go anywhere now, you've locked me in here. And then now you guys want to do this Out of the Darkness walk inside this prison. Is amazing. And so basically all we at AFSP did was said yes. We provided them with some resources and some materials. We have this great like guidebook for community walks and how they can plan a walk and the things they should do in sample timelines and things like that. I basically provided that information to them and said, think about what these different items are trying to get at in the community. So one item is like secure permits from the city or whatever for your park. What is that trying to do? Well, we need permission to do something here. And so what does that look like on the inside? And then in addition to that, so they had a volunteer committee that was just like it would have been on the outside. They planned this walk. We also equipped them to deliver the standard module of Talk Saves Lives to other people who were incarcerated. That first year, they had about 100 people attend, and it was such an inspiring thing to watch people who were incarcerated get this kind of information. And so fast forward a couple of years, that same sort of model has been replicated in 8 different prisons in Oregon, where they do this Talk Saves Lives presentation the day before the morning of this suicide prevention walk. And if you've been to an Out of the Darkness walk, so many of the same elements that are in a community walk are replicated in a different way that it just takes into consideration the environment. And instead of the colored beads for the memorial, the honor bead ceremony, they typically have used like silicone bracelets to represent, different colors.
Interesting.
But it's such an amazing thing to see. And I'll never forget, there's a couple things I'll never forget. One is that first year, I was emceeing the bead ceremony where, if you're not familiar with it, these colored beads each represents a different reason for being there to walk for suicide prevention. And so white represents the loss of a child, or green represents a personal struggle. So we have this beautiful ceremony where we go through these, and I'll never forget that first year, just seeing like so many of and it was a men's prison, like I'm emceeing this thing, I'm looking at this crowd of people that are incarcerated and they're really kind of tough, big guys. And there's dozens of people crying because they've never really like addressed this, and it's never really been safe for them to think about that part of their life story. And then also at a few years later at another prison, it's kind of funny because we had done this before in different places, but we noticed that there was nobody in this one particular prison was signing up to get a green bracelet to signify a personal struggle. And there was one of the guys was just like, are we really like, can we do this without getting like in trouble or having to go to treatment? Like there was a stigma for even just acknowledging that I've struggled in the past or that I currently struggle. And so in like part of it, like we're just changing the culture. We're making it okay to acknowledge the things that have impacted us. And that continue. I mean, in Oregon still, we continue to do those. And for the volunteers that have attended, we've typically been able to bring in 10 to 15 community volunteers to attend and just participate in the same way. They've said it's like their favorite thing, their favorite volunteer activity with the chapter.
That's amazing, and that's great hearing you talk about it, because I was already familiar with it, but that you just painted a picture of how beautiful a thing that is in such a real kind of authentic life kind of way. Yeah, and for those watching who aren't as familiar, the Out of the Darkness walks are a huge thing that takes place in communities across the country through AFSP, and there's their campus walks, their community walks, and then there's an overnight walk, which is a really particularly beautiful thing that happens generally, in June. And to have you explain what that looked like in a corrections environment is particularly, I think, really beautiful and inspiring. Because it's the thing about the walks is, I think some people think, oh, it's a suicide prevention walk, it's going to be really sad. And the reality is it's tons of people smiling a lot of the time because they realize they are surrounded by like a sea of other people who get it and who, either were very personally affected by our cause, or they're just someone who realizes that it's, the 10th leading cause of death and we all have mental health. And so when you mentioned about how there were some tears and things like that, because it was the first time some of these people had, in this particular environment, were able to realize that there's really no shame behind it at all. It's a health thing. It's mental health.
Yeah,
It's just as real.
and it's the similar experience that people have in the community where, you can like look around and physically see someone that you maybe knew, but you didn't know that well, but you didn't know they had this connection. And you can see, what, we both lost spouses to suicide. And there's an instant connection because it's not something we talk about. And it's powerful in corrections, it's powerful in community. So if you haven't been, make this the year if you can safely go.
Absolutely, make this the year. That's a wonderful way of putting it. So let's just, to wrap things up, what can the average everyday person do to help support this work?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that people can do, and I mentioned this before, but Project 2025 is a part of what we do at AFSP, and so I think that the first thing you can all do, regardless of your link to corrections, is if you're struggling, get help. Get help for yourself. If you know of others that might be struggling, you're not sure what to do, learn about it. Use the resources on our website or others, and encourage people to get help when they need it. I think that's like the key critical component, that no matter where you're at, if you need help, go get it. And I've heard it said before, I have teeth, I go to a dentist. If I have tooth pain or for regular maintenance, I have a brain, why wouldn't I get help for mental health? That's just, get help for yourself or encourage others to get it if they need it. I think that's first and foremost. I think second is, learn about what life is like for people in prison. There's a lot of opportunities to learn. You can read books, you can visit a local correctional facility, you can start volunteering. I think that we mentioned like movies and things like that before, that Hollywood has given us a portrayal of what it's like in prison. We may have a misguided view about what life is like, but if you can, go visit a prison or a facility, read some books about what life is like, and see how exercise your empathy muscles a little bit to try and see the real struggle that some of those folks are facing. And I'll tell you, if you do visit a correctional facility, there are definitely some elements that are similar to what you see on TV. And the first time I went for a walk, I'd gone to this place for a couple of meetings. The first time we went to the walk, we were walking out past the gym, and I was like, wow, I'm in prison, because it was a chained in thing where guys with no t-shirts on were lifting weights that were chained to the ground. So there are some things that you might be expecting, and that might be a little bit traumatic or difficult. So but if you're up to it and you can, go visit a facility and talk with people. But also you can connect with your local AFSP chapter. Brett's mentioned about that before. We have chapters across the country, and you can find them pretty easily. Just go into afsp.org. And if you're a volunteer in the corrections environment, there's lots of different organizations that do great work in corrections. You may have an ability to connect staff at your facility with your local chapter to present the Talk Saves Lives, but there may be other opportunities as well to connect. But also, if you work in corrections, if you're someone that works in corrections, a lot of you out there, there's a couple things you can do. Is one, again, connect with your local chapter and get some more information about the presentation, the Talk Saves Lives for Corrections environment. You can read the Suicide Prevention Resource Guide that we co-wrote alongside the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare. And another thing you can do is just speak up if there are policies, if there's something that we can do, if your colleagues aren't aware of the resources that are available through your employee assistance program, find out how you can raise the awareness about that, and do your best to create an environment where seeking help for mental health is a normal thing for people to do.
Well, yeah, I applause for all of that. Those are great. Those are great takeaways. And yeah, I would encourage anyone watching to check out the afsp.org website. I really encourage people to reach out to their local chapter for, whether they're interested specifically in Project 2025 or corrections, or just any of the stuff we were talking about, the walks program, the education. There are a million ways people can get involved in their community to as great or as little at an extent as they want. And it's just a great opportunity to meet other people who have some connection to the cause, and they just get it. So Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk about this. I loved how it ended up hitting on so many different aspects of our work, whether it's research or the walks and education, which I think speaks to how everything sort of comes together in our work. I also want to thank everyone watching. And I'll just say again, you can learn more about AFSP's Project 2025, in particular at afsp.org/Project 2025. So thank you again, Ryan, for having this conversation with me. Thank you to everyone watching, and take care.